No dramatization. No distortion. Just the record. Let's begin. Case 1. David Berkowitz. For more than a year, New York City had scenes, witnesses, letters, and a firearm pattern. What detectives did not have was a name. The person responsible moved across borough lines. At first, the incidents appeared separate. Different neighborhoods, different victims, different nights. Then a forensic detail began pulling them into the same file. The city created a task force. Tips came in from every direction. Patrol officers stayed alert. Detectives worked across precinct lines. The press followed every development. Still, the case remained open. Then the break came from something that did not look important at first, a parking citation. The first confirmed attack occurred on July 29, 1976. Over the next year, additional shootings were reported in the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn. 6 people were killed, and 7 others were injured. Investigators had to determine whether the city was dealing with unrelated crimes or one person moving through multiple boroughs. Ballistics gave them the first solid answer. Evidence connected the shootings to a .44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog revolver. That did not identify the perpetrator, but it allowed police to connect the incidents as a series. In a large investigation, that kind of linkage matters. It changes staffing, strategy, communication, and how evidence is compared. The New York City Police Department formed a dedicated task force of about 200 investigators. The scale of the operation reflected both the public concern and the investigative difficulty. Detectives reviewed witness accounts, studied physical evidence, traced possible vehicles, and followed tips from the public. Some leads appeared promising and went nowhere. Some witness statements were partial. Some public reports were based on fear or mistaken identification. The task force had to keep sorting, comparing, and returning to the facts already known. Several incidents occurred late at night, often involving people in or near parked vehicles. The victims ranged from 17 to 30 years old. The pattern gave investigators useful information, but not enough to predict the next location or identify the person responsible. Then came the letters. Written communications were sent to law enforcement and the press, including New York Daily News columnist Jimmy Breslin. Those letters helped create the public name associated with the case, Son of Sam. For investigators, the letters were evidence. They could be reviewed for wording, paper, envelopes, postage, fingerprints, mailing information, and possible clues about the writer. But the letters did not solve the case. They shaped public attention. They increased pressure. They gave investigators material to study. They did not provide a confirmed identity. The final confirmed attack occurred on July 31, 1977, in Bath Beach, Brooklyn. Stacy Moskowitz was killed, and Robert Violani was injured. After that incident, investigators reviewed information connected to the area. That review included parking and vehicle records. A parking citation issued near the scene led investigators to a vehicle associated with David Berkowitz of Yonkers. The citation did not prove guilt. It did not connect a firearm to Berkowitz. It did not explain motive. It simply placed a relevant vehicle in a relevant area at a relevant time. In a case with hundreds of leads, that was enough to focus attention. Detectives went to Yonkers and located the car. Surveillance followed. On August 10, 1977, Berkowitz was arrested outside his apartment building. He was 24 years old and worked as a postal employee. After his arrest, he made statements acknowledging responsibility. The legal process then turned partly to his mental condition. Berkowitz had made claims involving his neighbor's dog, and those claims became part of psychiatric review. Later, he stated publicly that the explanation had been fabricated. The court allowed the case to proceed. Berkowitz pleaded guilty to 6 murder charges. There was no jury trial on guilt. On June 12, 1978, he was sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms. The case did not end with sentencing. It moved into legislation. New York lawmakers faced a question raised by the public attention around the crimes. Should a convicted offender be allowed to profit from books, interviews, films, or other commercial accounts of a crime? The response became known as the Son of Sam Law. Its purpose was to direct certain crime-related profits toward victims or surviving family members. The original version was later struck down by the United States Supreme Court as too broad under the First Amendment, but revised versions followed. The Berkowitz investigation is still studied because it brought together ballistics, offender communication, public pressure, witness work, vehicle records, and legal reform. A parking ticket did what hundreds of leads had not. It gave the task force a name. Case 2. The Central Park 5. 5 teenagers were questioned. Statements were recorded. No DNA connected them to the crime scene. The case moved forward anyway. At first, the public saw a fast-moving investigation in one of New York City's most visible locations. Years later, the same case would be studied for a different reason. What happens when statements, pressure, and forensic evidence do not point in the same direction? The case began on April 19, 1989, when a 28-year-old woman was attacked while jogging in Central Park. The incident drew immediate public attention. Police were also investigating other reported events in the park that night, which made the early timeline difficult to separate. Central Park was not just a location. It was a symbol. An attack there drew attention from police leadership, city officials, newspapers, television stations, and the public. The pressure to solve the case quickly was intense. Within days, investigators focused on 5 teenagers from Harlem: Antron McCrae, Kevin Richardson, Yusef Salam, Raymond Santana, and Corey Wise. They were between 14 and 16 years old. Prosecutors later relied heavily on statements attributed to them after extended questioning. The interrogations became the center of the case. Some questioning took place before recorded statements were made. That distinction matters. A recorded statement can show what a suspect said at the end of an interrogation, but it may not show how the statement developed, what was said before the recording began, or whether details were introduced earlier. Defense attorneys argued that the teenagers were vulnerable because of their age, the length of questioning, and the pressure of the process. Prosecutors argued at trial that the statements were voluntary and supported by other evidence. The physical evidence raised a serious problem. DNA testing available at the time did not match any of the 5 teenagers to biological evidence from the crime scene. Prosecutors acknowledged the absence of a match, but argued that it did not exclude involvement. The defense argued that the DNA result was central, especially because the statements were inconsistent. Those inconsistencies were important. The statements differed on roles, details, timing, and actions. They did not produce one clear account. In a case built largely around admissions, those differences mattered. Still, the case proceeded to trial. In 1990, all 5 teenagers were convicted. The charges varied, but each of them was sentenced and sent to prison. For years, the convictions stood. The public record showed guilt. The prison records showed time served. But the physical evidence still had not connected them to the crime scene. The case changed in 2002. Matias Reyes, who was already incarcerated for other crimes, stated that he alone had committed the Central Park attack. By that time, DNA testing had advanced. Evidence from the original case was retested. The DNA matched Reyes and did not match the 5 original defendants. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office reviewed the case under District Attorney Robert Morgenthau. That review looked at the original statements, the forensic evidence, Reyes's account, and the physical facts. It found that the teenagers' statements conflicted with one another and with important evidence. In December of 2002, the convictions were vacated. The men later filed civil claims against the city of New York. In 2014, the city agreed to a settlement of approximately $41 million, with no admission of wrongdoing. The case reshaped discussions about juvenile interrogation, false confessions, DNA testing, media pressure, and race in the justice system. It also showed why confession evidence must be tested against physical proof, timelines, and independent corroboration. A confession can sound final. A conviction can look permanent. But the record can change when the evidence is examined again. The public first knew them as the Central Park 5. The corrected record knows them as the exonerated 5. Case 3. Pedro Hernandez and the Etan Patz case. A 6-year-old child left home for a short walk to a school bus stop. He did not arrive. No one found him that morning. No physical evidence gave investigators a clear answer. The search would last decades. On May 25, 1979, Etan Patz left his family's apartment in Soho. He was walking to a school bus stop on West Broadway. It was the first time his parents had allowed him to make that walk alone. When Etan did not arrive at school, the search began. Officers and detectives canvassed the neighborhood, spoke with residents and business owners, and examined locations along the route he was expected to take. No remains attributable to him were recovered. The case became one of the most recognized missing child cases in American history. Etan's photograph was widely circulated, and his disappearance helped shape national awareness around missing children. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan designated May 25th as National Missing Children's Day. In 1984, Congress passed the Missing Children's Assistance Act, which helped establish the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Etan's case was not the only case behind these changes, but it became one of the most visible. For investigators, the case was difficult from the start. There was no recovered child. There was no confirmed crime scene. There was no immediate physical evidence identifying what happened. Detectives had to work through witness accounts, neighborhood information, possible suspects, and later reports that came in over the years. One person who received long-term attention was Jose Antonio Ramos. Ramos had a criminal history involving offenses against children and had connections to people known to the Patz family. He was never criminally charged in Etan's disappearance. A civil court later found him responsible in a wrongful death case, but that civil finding was later set aside after the criminal case took a different direction. That direction came in May of 2012. Investigators interviewed Pedro Hernandez in Maple Shade, New Jersey. Hernandez had lived in Soho in 1979 and had worked at a bodega near Etan's bus stop. During questioning, he made statements describing involvement in Etan's disappearance. Prosecutors treated those statements as confessions. The defense challenged them. The evidence issue was clear. There was no recovered body. There was no physical evidence directly tying Hernandez to Etan. The prosecution relied heavily on his statements and on testimony from people who said he had made earlier remarks suggesting involvement. The defense presented Hernandez as a person with mental health history, limited intellectual functioning, and vulnerability to suggestion. Defense experts argued that his statements were unreliable. Prosecutors argued that his account was credible and supported by other testimony. The first trial ended with a deadlocked jury. That result showed how divided the evidence could be. Some jurors accepted the confession evidence. At least one did not find it enough. The case was tried again. In 2017, a second jury convicted Hernandez of murder and kidnapping. He was sentenced to 25 years to life. The legal record changed again in 2025. A federal appeals court overturned the conviction, focusing on jury instructions related to Hernandez's confessions. The ruling required a new trial or release. Prosecutors continued to pursue the case. The Patz case carries two legacies. One is national and policy-based, missing child awareness, public alerts, and coordinated response. The other is legal, how courts should evaluate confession evidence when no body and no direct physical evidence are available. The case asks a hard question. When decades have passed, when physical evidence is absent, and when the central proof is a statement, what is enough for a conviction? Etan Patz's name still stands at the center of America's missing children system, and at the center of a prosecution that continues to test the limits of confession evidence. Case 4. Winston Moseley and the Kitty Genovese case. A woman was killed near her apartment building in Queens. That was the crime. But the story that made the case famous came later. 2 weeks after Catherine Susan Genovese died, a newspaper article turned the case into a national symbol. The article claimed that dozens of neighbors had witnessed or heard what happened and failed to respond. For decades, that version shaped classrooms, research, journalism, and public debate. The question is not only what happened that morning. The question is how one report became one of the most repeated crime stories in America. In the early morning hours of March 13, 1964, Catherine Genovese, known as Kitty, returned to Kew Gardens, Queens. She was 28 years old and worked as a bar manager. She was attacked near her apartment building and died from her injuries. Police investigated. Winston Moseley was later arrested after a separate burglary investigation. During questioning, he admitted responsibility for the attack on Genovese. He was tried, convicted of first-degree murder, and initially sentenced to death. That sentence was later changed to life imprisonment. The criminal case was important, but it was the reporting that made the case known around the world. On March 27, 1964, the New York Times published a front-page article describing neighbors who allegedly failed to act. The public version became simple. 38 people knew what was happening and did nothing. That narrative spread quickly. It became a symbol of urban indifference. It also influenced social psychology. Researchers John Darley and Bib Lataine began studying how people respond to emergencies when others are present. Their work helped define the bystander effect and the idea of diffusion of responsibility. The research became legitimate and important. The original story, however, did not hold up. Later investigation showed that the famous version was significantly overstated. The number of people who clearly saw or understood the attack was much lower than reported. Some neighbors heard sounds, but did not know what was happening. Some saw only part of the event. Some believed the situation had ended. At least one person called police. The layout of the area also mattered. The event was not a single clear scene visible to dozens of people from beginning to end. Distance, lighting, windows, and building design all affected what residents could know. The New York Times later acknowledged that its original reporting had overstated both the number of witnesses and the extent of inaction. That acknowledgement came decades after the first article shaped public memory. The corrected version is more complex than the public myth. It is not accurate to say 38 people watched a crime from start to finish and refused to act. It is more accurate to say that several people heard or saw parts of the incident, that confusion existed, and that the original article turned uncertainty into a powerful moral narrative. The case also became part of public discussion about emergency reporting. Before 911 became standard, callers often needed to know local numbers for police, fire, or medical help. The Genovese case did not single-handedly create 911, but it became part of the larger conversation that helped move the country toward a simpler emergency number. For journalism, the lesson remains sharp. A powerful story can travel faster than a carefully verified record. A number can become famous before anyone proves it. The crime was real. The newspaper story was flawed. The consequences reshaped research, journalism, and emergency response. Case 5. Mark David Chapman and the Death of John Lennon. A world-famous musician returned home in Manhattan. A man was waiting outside the building. Within minutes, the case would move from a police response to a global public event. The legal question was not who remained at the scene. It was what the court would do with a defendant whose mental condition became part of the record, and who later rejected the trial strategy prepared by his own lawyers. On December 8, 1980, John Winston Ono Lennon was 40 years old and living at the Dakota on the Upper West Side. He lived there with Yoko Ono and their son, Sean. Earlier that day, Lennon had encountered Mark David Chapman outside the building. Chapman obtained Lennon's signature. Later, Lennon and Ono returned from a recording session. Chapman was still outside. As Lennon approached the entrance, Chapman fired at him. Lennon was transported to Roosevelt Hospital and pronounced dead. Chapman did not leave the area. Police took him into custody near the scene. He was found with a copy of J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. Chapman was 25 years old and had traveled from Hawaii to New York. His conduct before the crime, including his focus on Lennon and repeated presence near the Dakota, later became part of public discussion about fixation on public figures. Chapman was charged with second-degree murder. His attorneys initially considered an insanity defense, which would have required a trial involving psychiatric evidence. Mental health evaluations became part of the case record. Before trial, Chapman chose to plead guilty. His lawyers opposed that decision. He entered the plea anyway. In August of 1981, he was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. He later became eligible for parole and has been denied release repeatedly. The case changed how many public figures thought about access and security. Lennon had lived in New York with a level of public visibility that later became harder to imagine. After his death, entertainers, artists, athletes, and their representatives reassessed residential access, security routines, and repeated contact from unknown individuals. It would be inaccurate to say the Lennon case directly created modern stalking law. Those statutes developed later through multiple cases and legislative efforts. But Lennon's death became part of the broader history of concern about targeted attention, fixation, and vulnerability among public figures. The case also changed the public landscape of New York City. In 1985, Strawberry Fields was dedicated in Central Park as a memorial to Lennon. The Imagine mosaic became its central feature. The site is not a crime scene. It is a place of remembrance. The Dakota remains one of Manhattan's most recognized residential buildings. Its architectural history existed long before December 8, 1980, but public understanding of the building changed permanently after Lenin's death. The legal proceedings were brief compared with many major homicide cases. The public memory has lasted far longer. The criminal case ended with a guilty plea, but the conversation about access, fame, and safety never ended. Case 6. Kenneth Boss, Sean Carroll, Edward McMillan, Richard Murphy, and the death of Amadou Diallo. 41 shots were fired outside an apartment building in the Bronx. The man who was shot was unarmed. The object officers later said they believed was a weapon was a wallet. The case would move from a street encounter to a grand jury, from the Bronx to Albany, and from criminal court into one of the most important public debates about policing in New York. In the early morning hours of February 4, 1999, Amadou Diallo stood near the entrance to his apartment building in the Soundview section of the Bronx. He was 23 years old and had immigrated from Guinea. 4 plainclothes officers from the New York City Police Department's Street Crime Unit approached him. Kenneth Boss, Sean Carroll, Edward McMillan, and Richard Murphy. They were traveling in an unmarked vehicle as part of a unit assigned to target violent crime and illegal firearms. The officers later said they believed Diallo's conduct was suspicious. They stated that when they approached, they thought he was reaching for a weapon. The object was his wallet. The officers fired 41 shots. 19 struck Diallo. The Bronx District Attorney's Office presented the matter to a grand jury. In March of 1999, all 4 officers were indicted on charges that included second-degree murder and reckless endangerment. Criminal charges against officers after fatal on-duty shootings are uncommon. The indictments made the case one of the most closely watched prosecutions in New York. Defense attorneys sought a change of venue. They argued that the officers could not receive a fair trial in the Bronx because of intense publicity and public response. The trial was moved to Albany County. That decision produced its own controversy. Community advocates argued that the trial had been removed from the borough most directly affected. Defense supporters argued that a fair jury pool was required. The trial began in January of 2000. Prosecutors focused on the number of shots, the circumstances of the encounter, and whether the use of force was justified. Defense attorneys argued that the officers had to be judged from the perspective of what they believed in the moment, not from what later proved to be true. The legal standard centered on objective reasonableness. The question was not simply whether Diallo was later found to be unarmed. The question was whether the officers' perception and response were legally reasonable under the circumstances as they understood them. The prosecution argued that the shooting was not justified. The defense argued that the officers made a mistaken but legally understandable decision during a rapidly developing encounter. On February 25, 2000, the jury acquitted all 4 officers of all charges. The verdicts produced immediate protest. For many civil rights advocates, the outcome showed the limits of criminal prosecution in police shooting cases. For the defense, it reflected the jury's conclusion that the state had not proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The federal government later reviewed the case and declined to bring criminal civil rights charges. The Diallo family filed a civil lawsuit. In 2004, New York City agreed to a $3 million settlement, with no admission of wrongdoing. The NYPD Street Crime Unit remained under scrutiny. Civil rights organizations challenged its practices, particularly stops and searches in communities of color. In 2002, the unit was disbanded. The case became a recurring reference point in debates about plainclothes policing, racial profiling, stop-and-frisk practices, officer training, and accountability. The officers were acquitted. The institution changed anyway. Case 7. Bernard Madoff. The account statements looked steady. The returns looked consistent. The reputation looked secure. Then the market turned, withdrawals increased, and one of the most respected names on Wall Street could no longer maintain the appearance. What collapsed in December of 2008 was not an investment strategy. It was a decades-long Ponzi scheme. Bernard Lawrence Madoff was arrested on December 11, 2008. The disclosure began inside his family. He told his sons that the investment advisory business was not legitimate. They reported the information to federal authorities. At the time of collapse, customer statements showed approximately $65 billion in claimed balances. That number included fictitious returns. Actual principal losses were approximately $17 billion. Clients believed their money was being invested through a strategy involving equities and options. They received statements showing trades, balances, and steady returns. The documents appeared official. The trades, however, were not happening. The structure was a Ponzi scheme. Money from newer investors was used to satisfy withdrawals from earlier investors. Fabricated documents maintained the appearance of legitimate performance. The fraud succeeded because it used trust, reputation, exclusivity, and paperwork. Some clients believed they had access to a respected financial operator who accepted only certain investors. Others invested through feeder funds, which directed large blocks of client money into Madoff's operation. After the arrest, federal investigators, prosecutors, forensic accountants, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Securities Investor Protection Corporation, and a court-appointed trustee became involved. Investigators examined Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities and its offices in Manhattan's Lipstick Building. The investment advisory operation was separate from the firm's legitimate market-making side. That separation helped false records avoid ordinary comparison with actual trades. Forensic accountants found false account statements, false trade confirmations, false tax documents, and records showing investment activity that had never occurred. The fraud was not hidden in complex trading. It was hidden behind documents that clients trusted. The regulatory failure became one of the most important parts of the case. The SEC's Office of Inspector General later found that the agency had received 6 substantive complaints between 1992 and 2008 that raised serious red flags. Financial analyst Harry Markopolos had warned the SEC that Madoff's reported results were not mathematically plausible. The warnings were not acted upon effectively. On March 12, 2009, Madoff pleaded guilty to 11 federal felony counts. The charges included securities fraud, investment advisor fraud, mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, false statements, perjury, false SEC filings, and theft from an employee benefit plan. There was no trial. He admitted guilt in court. On June 29, 2009, Judge Denny Chin sentenced him to 150 years in federal prison. The sentence reflected the scale of the fraud, the number of victims, and the harm done to individuals, families, charities, and institutions. Madoff died in federal custody on April 14, 2021. The recovery process continued long after sentencing. Trustee Irving Picard pursued funds from banks, feeder funds, and other entities connected to the scheme. Separate compensation also came through the Department of Justice's Madoff Victim Fund. The case strengthened support for whistleblower reform. Dodd-Frank expanded the SEC whistleblower program, creating financial awards and protections for people who provide original information leading to successful enforcement actions. The numbers were fabricated. The losses were real. The regulatory failure became part of the record. Case 8. John Lester, Scott Kern, Jason Ladone, and the Howard Beach case. A car broke down in Queens. 4 black men were traveling together. 1 stayed with the vehicle. 3 walked into a neighborhood to look for help. What followed became one of the most important racial violence prosecutions in New York City during the 1980s. On the night of December 19th into the early morning of December 20th, 1986, Curtis Sylvester stayed with the disabled car. Michael Griffith, Cedric Sandiford, and Timothy Grimes walked into Howard Beach to seek assistance. Howard Beach was a predominantly white neighborhood. Their presence there became the beginning of a confrontation with a group of white youths. The encounter escalated into pursuit and violence. Michael Griffith fled toward the Belt Parkway and was struck by a vehicle. He died from injuries sustained in that collision. Cedric Sandiford survived after being attacked. Timothy Grimes escaped. The incident produced immediate public response in New York City. The facts raised questions about race, neighborhood boundaries, violence, police response, and whether local authorities would pursue the case with sufficient urgency. Civil rights leaders, community organizations, and public officials pressed for a thorough investigation. Civil rights attorneys C. Vernon Mason and Reverend Al Sharpton were among the visible advocates demanding accountability. Governor Mario Cuomo appointed Charles J. Hines as special prosecutor. That appointment moved the case away from ordinary local control and placed it under an independent prosecutorial structure. The special prosecutor mechanism mattered. It gave the state a way to respond when public trust in a local investigation was in question. It also signaled that the case had importance beyond one neighborhood. The prosecution focused on the defendants' roles in the confrontation, the pursuit, and the events that led to Griffith's death. The central legal issue was causation. Griffith was struck by a passing vehicle, but prosecutors argued that the pursuit created the danger that led to his death. In group prosecutions, the state must prove individual responsibility. It is not enough to show that a group was present. Prosecutors had to connect each defendant to conduct that satisfied the elements of the charges. John Lester, Scott Kern, and Jason Ladwan were charged along with others. The jury did not convict them of the most serious murder charges. On December 21, 1987, Lester, Kern, and Ladwan were convicted of second-degree manslaughter in connection with Michael Griffith's death and first-degree assault in connection with Cedric Sandiford. Lester received 10 to 30 years. Kern received 6 to 18 years. Ladwan received 5 to 15 years. The case unfolded during a period of racial tension in New York City. It was followed by other high-profile incidents, including the killing of Yusuf Hawkins in Bensonhurst in 1989. Together, these cases intensified public demand for stronger legal tools addressing bias-motivated violence. New York did not immediately pass a hate crime statute after Howard Beach. The legislative process took years. In 2000, the state enacted its hate crimes law, creating enhanced penalties for crimes committed because of protected characteristics such as race, religion, national origin, gender, disability, and sexual orientation. Howard Beach did not create that law by itself. It became one of the cases that made the need for such legislation harder to ignore. A broken-down car became a criminal case, a public reckoning, and a turning point in New York's hate crime debate. Case 9. Robert Chambers and the death of Jennifer Levin. A young woman was found in Central Park in the early morning. Within hours, investigators had a name. Within months, the case had a media label that would outlive much of the court record. Jennifer Levin was 18 years old when she was found on August 26, 1986. Investigators quickly focused on Robert Chambers, a 19-year-old who had been seen leaving an Upper East Side bar with her earlier that morning. The case became one of the most widely covered New York criminal matters of the 1980s. Newspapers and television programs called it the Preppy murder. That phrase became widely recognized, but it also shaped the story in ways critics later questioned. The investigation relied on witness accounts, timeline evidence, forensic pathology, and Chambers' own statements. Witnesses helped place Levin and Chambers together before she was found. Investigators reviewed where they had been seen, when they left the bar, and what Chambers later said had happened. Chambers was charged with second-degree murder. His account changed over time. The defense eventually presented the death as the unintended result of a private encounter. Prosecutors argued that the evidence supported criminal responsibility for murder. The trial began in January of 1988. It lasted several weeks. Medical evidence, expert testimony, and witness accounts were central. The jury had to consider not only what Chambers said, but whether the physical evidence supported or contradicted his explanation. The defense strategy became one of the most controversial parts of the case. It placed attention on Jennifer Levin's conduct and private life. Media coverage amplified those themes, often focusing on social background, nightlife, class, and private school connections. That coverage shaped public memory. The label attached to the case made it sound like a story about social status. For many critics, that framing moved attention away from the evidence and from Levin herself. The trial ended without a verdict. After 9 days of deliberation, the jury remained deadlocked, and the court declared a mistrial. Prosecutors prepared for a second trial. Before it began, Chambers accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter. Under that plea, he admitted causing serious physical injury that resulted in Levin's death, without pleading guilty to murder. He was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison and served the full term. He was released in 2003. The case returned to public attention years later for a separate matter. In 2007, Chambers was arrested in a drug investigation. In 2008, he pleaded guilty in that later case and received a 19-year sentence. He was released from New York State Prison in July of 2023. The original case remains important because of how it was covered. The media focused heavily on class, appearance, schools, nightlife, and social circles. Critics argued that this framing pushed the legal issues into the background and placed unnecessary attention on Jennifer Levin's personal life. For documentary work, the better approach is to name the people, state the evidence, and follow the court record. The legal outcome was not a murder conviction. It was a mistrial followed by a plea to manslaughter. The verdict never came from the jury. The lasting lesson came from the coverage. Case 10. Heriberto Seda and the New York Zodiac case. The letters came with symbols. The attacks had a pattern. The name attached to the case was borrowed from another investigation on the other side of the country. For years, New York police had communications, scenes, and linked evidence. What they did not have was the person behind them. Between 1990 and 1993, a series of shootings took place across New York City. 3 people were killed, and 5 others were injured in the attacks attributed to the person who became known as the New York Zodiac. The perpetrator sent communications to law enforcement and the media. The letters claimed responsibility for attacks, referred to astrology, and used symbols that resembled communications from the earlier Zodiac case in Northern California. Investigators considered whether there was any connection to the California Zodiac. No connection was established. The New York case was treated as a separate investigation involving a person who appeared to copy parts of the earlier case. The attacks occurred across multiple boroughs, including Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island. The victims did not provide one simple personal connection that would identify a suspect. Investigators had linked incidents, written communications, and a public name for the perpetrator, but they did not have the offender's identity. The NYPD created task forces and examined letters, crime scenes, witness accounts, and ballistic information. The communications were important because they gave detectives a common thread across different incidents. They were also potential evidence. Letters can contain handwriting patterns, fingerprints, DNA from stamps or envelopes, paper characteristics, and mailing information. For years, the case remained open. That changed in June of 1996 through a separate police response. Officers responded to a domestic incident involving Heriberto Seda in Brooklyn. Seda was arrested after shooting his half-sister and firing at responding police officers. During the investigation that followed, police noticed a symbol on his written statement that resembled markings used in the Zodiac communications. That detail redirected attention to the old case. Investigators compared Seda's handwriting with letters sent by the New York Zodiac. They also reviewed physical and forensic evidence, including reported ballistic or toolmark evidence, fingerprints, and DNA from a stamp used to mail one of the communications. The case against Seda did not rest on one piece of evidence. It was built through comparison, writing, symbols, physical evidence, and the circumstances of the 1996 arrest. In June of 1998, Seda was convicted of 3 murders and multiple attempted murders. He was sentenced to 232 years in prison. The case is useful for understanding the limits of serial crime investigation. Police had connected the crimes, but linkage did not identify the offender. A pattern can show that one person is likely responsible, but it cannot provide a name by itself. Seda was identified because a separate incident produced new evidence. Once police had a known person, known writing, and access to physical evidence, older materials could be compared. That is why preservation matters. Evidence that cannot solve a case in 1 year may become decisive years later. The case also shows why offender communications must be handled carefully. Letters can help investigators link crimes and generate public awareness. They can also give the sender attention. Law enforcement and media organizations must balance investigative value against the risk of amplifying the perpetrator's message. The task force did not find him first. A separate police response did, and the old evidence finally had a name. You have been watching Crime Watch Chronicles, 10 New York crime cases that changed American law, public policy, investigative practice, and the way the country understands justice. If this documentary provided value, please hit the like button. Leave a comment with the case that stayed with you most. And if you are not yet subscribed, subscribe to Crime Watch Chronicles and turn on notifications so you do not miss future documentaries. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next one. Crime Watch Chronicles. Verified facts. Documented records.